My guest today started his career in the RPG industry at TSR in the 1980s, working on advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And today he is a professor teaching the next generation game design.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Hey guys, welcome to the show. My name is Matt and I am your host. This is the show where we talk about all kinds of awesome, cool stuff that will help us become better game masters and better role players. If you don't know, I create original tabletop RPG resources. You can find those at dicegeeks.com. If you want something special, however, I have released a free fantasy RPG campaign. It is called The King's Road. You can find that for free at drivethrurpg.com. Just search for The King's Road. It is kind of just my gift to all of you for being so incredibly awesome. My guest today has an incredible amount of game design credits. He has worked at TSR on AD&D. He has worked on Far Cry 3 and other video games as well. So let's just dive into this conversation today. My guest today teaches game and narrative design at Webster University, Mike Breault. Mike, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me, Matt.
Let's just kind of start at the beginning. When were you first introduced to tabletop role-playing games?
It was in college, 1976. I just happened to be, I was going to the cafeteria and I happened to notice a sign that said, come be a dwarf or an elf and, play this new D&D thing. And so I joined up and it was pretty weird and chaotic. There were like 20 people playing my first game there and one DM.
Oh, wow.
It was, it was original, well, not original D&D. The original D&D was the kind of faux wood box, but it was the white box set, which I still have, and I show it to students in my classes. But that was my introduction. I played D&D throughout college, and that was how I got introduced to it.
Now, I think I read something online. Some of your gaming group flunked out of college because they were playing D&D too much.
Yeah, this was at RPI, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, where I went to college, and it was the Science Fiction and Fantasy Game Club, and there were about 40 people in it, and we ended up playing so much D&D, and there were also other games like Chivalry and Sorcery and some other kind of clones of D&D. We'd play probably 2 or 3 nights a week, plus all weekend. We'd start Friday night and play through Sunday evening, and just various people would pass out and stuff, and we'd run their characters while they were sleeping. And about a third of the club flunked out that year, my first year.
Oh, gosh.
And yeah, so that was, survival of the fittest, I guess.
Well, that's something else that they would be playing so much that they would flunk out. But I discovered it a little earlier, but I since I started playing when I was 9, but we did have some of those weekends like that kind of too, where we would play just all weekend, start Friday afternoon after school, and just wouldn't stop until Sunday evening or something. But you ended up with a career in gaming, but your academic background is astronomy. Is that correct?
Yes, astronomy and physics.
Okay.
I went to RPI and I got a bachelor's, a BS in physics with a minor in astronomy. And then I went to grad school. I went to the PhD program in astrophysics at Indiana University. And after about 2 to 3 years there, I realized it wasn't for me and I wasn't for it. So I spent another year kind of trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And while I was there in grad school, I met my wife. Wasn't my wife at the time, but she is now. And she was she was in the MFA program in creative writing, and she kind of got me into some writing classes. And I thought that was more of what I wanted to do. So I started looking for jobs related to that, and I got a job as an editorial intern at a magazine in town. a political magazine called The American Spectator. And when people ask me how I got into the game industry, I always say it was because of the Chicago Cubs, because the American Spectator had a Chicago Cubs Day every year. And we went up to Chicago, saw the Cubs. My wife and I stayed overnight. And the next morning, she saw an ad in the Sunday Chicago Tribune for a games editor. And she didn't recognize the company, but I recognized it as TSR, the D&D people. And so I applied, and they, hired me. And that was my start in the game industry. And I always say the Chicago Cubs got me into the game industry.
All right. Well, we're in St. Louis now, so I should just throw out the Cardinals a little bit. So,
yeah, go Cards, I guess. Yeah,
that is some story there that you just responded to an ad in the paper and were hired at TSR.
And in my classes, I use that as an example to students, telling them that you're getting a degree here in game design, but you never really know where your career is going to take you. So. Mm-hmm. Some class that you take as sort of a general ed class, like sociology or something, might spark a love of that topic in you and might end up with that as a career. And so I just tell students to kind of be open to all the various pathways that'll come to them as they leave college and start their career. You never really know where your career is going to take you.
I think that's great advice. I went to college. I studied film and screenwriting, and just the last 7 years here that, I worked a job that didn't even exist when I was in college. I did search engine optimization. It didn't even exist when I was in college. So, I mean, it's just the way things go. And of course, now I'm doing role-playing games, which is kind of a childhood dream. But
right.
It's just, it is amazing how when kind of life starts happening and where things can kind of come in, that things will take you in different directions.
And when I tell students that, game careers didn't exist when I was in college, mm-hmm. I point out to them that there are careers that don't exist right now that could get into 5 or 10 years from now that, might be just perfect fits for them. Even though they're trained for game design or whatever, this might be a perfect fit. And it just doesn't exist when they're in college, whatever that career might be. Mm-hmm. So just keep open to that, keep looking for other avenues to use your skills in.
While you were at TSR, what were some of the books that you worked on?
Mostly I worked on AD&D products, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, which no longer exists, mm-hmm. except in used bookstores. And the students nowadays are always amazed when I tell them that back then AD&D was the thing, and D&D, the company management almost killed D&D off. They almost decided to discontinue it because AD&D was 90% of our income and D&D was, just 10% or 5%. And they almost decided it wasn't worth the trouble to keep it going. So most of what I worked on was AD&D stuff. I worked on the Dragonlance line of adventures. I was the editor-developer for the second edition AD&D Player's Handbook, and I worked on the Dungeon Master's Guide. There were another 4 hardback books I worked on, like Oriental Adventures and Manual of the Plains, and what are the other 2? Dungeoneer's Survival Guide and Dragonlance Adventures. And then a whole bunch of modules and adventures and box sets. And I worked on a few other games, like the Conan role-playing game that we had that didn't sell well, and the Indiana Jones role-playing game that didn't sell well. I worked on Gamma World, which is a science fiction role-playing game. There were just a whole bunch of products and some war games that TSR did with their SPI line that they had bought. And just roughly, I guess, a little bit over 90 modules and hardback books and box games and all that stuff.
Did you work more on like scenarios, or did you actually create rules for the systems?
It was mostly scenarios. When we did the second edition AD&D rules, that was creating a whole new rule system. And I was only a minor part of that. That was mostly like Zeb Cook and Steve Winter did most of the lifting there. Mm-hmm. So it was mostly adventures, scenarios, modules, and then some box sets of like Gamma World role-playing game or the Gamma Marauders board game or things like that. So yeah, it was a lot of Dragonlance adventures and other modules.
Then after your time at TSR, you moved into video games. Is that correct?
Yes. While I was at TSR, it was 1987. I was offered the opportunity to work on the first AD&D computer game. It was Pool of Radiance. Mm-hmm. And four of us, myself, Jim Ward, Steve Winter, and Zeb Cook, were the designers for the game. And off in California was SSI, the company that was going to publish the game, and they had all the programmers and artists and animators and sound designers, all those things. But we did the design at TSR in Wisconsin, and then that was kind of sent over to SSI, and they basically implemented the design. So the four of us designed it, and that kind of gave me the digital game bug. And I went into digital games. I went freelance for about 10 years and worked for companies all over the country. I did a bunch of Sega Genesis games, did a bunch of games that probably people have never heard of, but just a whole lot of freelance work for small companies and big companies. And then after about 10 years as a freelancer, I decided to join Volition, the company that makes the Red Faction series of games and Saints Row and a bunch of other stuff. I joined them in 1999 and have basically been in-house at various companies ever since. And so, I guess all told, it's about 90 analog games, paper role-playing games and board games, and roughly 40 digital games. A lot of first-person shooters and space simulators and things like that. And then the last few years, I've gotten into teaching. Basically, I've gotten to the period in my life where I feel like I've learned enough that I kind of want to pass things on to like the next generation of game designers and narrative designers. And so I've taught for a couple of years at UT Dallas, University of Texas, Dallas, which has a big program. And I've done some adjunct teaching at Miami of Ohio and Bradley and Butler and also George Mason. And now I'm here full-time at Webster. I started here last year. This will be my second year here. And we have a growing program. There are about 85 students in the game design program right now. And it's kind of growing. Some years it leaps a lot. Some years it kind of creeps along and grows just a little bit. But I found it's a lot of fun teaching. And I've also, I really like communicating the things that I feel like I've learned over my career, and talking to students about the game industry and what it's like to work in it, and what people are like and all that. And I've also found I learn a lot as I'm teaching, because it feels to me that you never really know something until you're trying to teach it to somebody else. And as I'm kind of formalizing all these things that I've been doing for years and years and years, it's like, oh, that's what I was doing all that time. Yeah, this kind of makes sense now. And so trying to convey it to students, to this audience, people who are very interested in games, it really makes me understand a lot more about game design and narrative design and what I was doing all those years. So it's a really interesting process to be a teacher, teach the things that you were doing for basically 35 years. I started in 1984, and I'm still working on games now, even though I'm teaching as well. Anyway, so that's probably a lot longer answer than you wanted, but
we'll get more into your teaching and things here in a minute. But I just wanted to ask, obviously my audience who are listening to the podcast, they're role players, they're game masters, they're interested in creative writing, they're interested in game design as well. Since you worked on so many adventures while you were at TSR, could you just tell us what makes a great adventure?
To me, every good adventure really has a focus on the player. You can tell that the designer, the people who are creating that adventure, or that whether it's a video game or a analog game, they were really focused on the experience they were going to give the player. And just, a lot of designers have a lot of trouble kind of dissociating themselves from the work they're doing. They're thinking of what they would enjoy, and I'm making this game and it's going to be great, and they never really think about the player, the audience for their game. And to me, great games really think about that player experience, and that's something that I think designers, narrative designers, and game designers really need to focus on, is just kind of conveying a really fun, engaging experience to players. And to do that, you really have to be thinking about the player all the time, who your audience is, what they expect out of the type of game that you're making, and how you're going to deliver that experience that they want. So yeah, that's something that I think is critical, and it's hard for people to do. It's hard for people to not think of themselves as the audience for their game, but realize there's a whole spectrum of people that you're trying to appeal to, and you want your game to engage all those people, and you just have to concentrate on the player, the audience that you're making that for. And I think that really makes a great game, and that's something that I talk to my students about. We have exercises in class where they analyze themselves as players, and then they read other people's analyses of themselves. And it, I think, brings home the fact that, hey, everybody wants something different out of, say, an FPS or a real-time strategy game or a role-playing game. Whatever they're playing, you've got this variety of players, and it's not just you. And so you've got to think of the player all the time.
Then what about the perspective of, say, a game master? I'm sure you've run a lot of games in the past. From that perspective of a game master, maybe what's something a game master can do to really kind of engage their players?
The thing when I teach analog classes as well as digital classes. When I'm leading an analog design class, I talk to the students about always thinking about the fact that they're bringing a bunch of people around a table to have a social experience. That's the core of every analog game, whether it's a role-playing game or a board game. You're bringing a bunch of people together, experience. And the most critical thing is to get those people interacting as much as possible. And one of the things I talk about is that for a master or game master, to encourage conflict among the players, not conflict as in fights and anger and table flipping, but conflict in presenting the group with some appealing options. And different people want to do different things, and they have to negotiate and talk. And if they split the party up, go down two different roads, they're all going to die. They have to stick together, but which of those two appealing paths do they choose? In getting people really engaged with negotiating and talking at each other and just kind of working things out really enhances the social aspect, the social element of all analog games. And that's something that I work with students, really enhancing that. Some students will start out with, especially with a board game, and you look at it and they've got four people around a table and they're essentially playing four versions of solitaire. They're not interacting very much. And that's something I hammer away at. And in a role-playing game, for a dungeon master, come up with scenarios where there are different attractive things for the party to do, and they have to negotiate. They have to figure out some consensus. And that, to me, really enhances the social experience. That really is the core of a role-playing game, is that social experience with your friends and, strangers who become friends.
I'm just wondering now too, since you mentioned several times, analog games versus digital games. What is that kind of process like for you? Like when you went from, pen and paper to computer, what were some of the things that you had to kind of learn to make that transition?
It's actually not that hard a transition. And there are lots, as you probably know, lots and lots of people who've made that change from analog games to digital games, and some of them have gone back again to analog. I'm working on a board game right now that we can talk about later. But if you look at, I don't know if you've ever played Diablo, the digital game Diablo.
Yeah.
You look at a snapshot of Diablo, and then you look at a picture of a typical role-playing game, they're the same thing.
Yeah.
Diablos, they've layered on, imagery and animation and sound, but it's the same game mechanics. And there are just so many people who started out in the analog role-playing industry and kind of migrated into digital games because the game design is very, very similar. Once you talk about implementation for an analog role-playing game, you need to create a booklet and you need to get artwork in it and you need to come up with dialogue and all that stuff. And in a digital game, you get programmers involved and artists and animators and riggers and all sorts of other people, but it's really just kind of icing on the same cake as far as I'm concerned. And when we were, my first experience was Pool of Radiance back in 1987. And, none of us had ever worked on a computer game before. And we did basically the paper design for it. I drew a whole bunch of paper maps. Pool of Radiance was a central town of Flan and then all these areas around it. And I did all the areas around Flan. And I would be drawing maps and writing up basically quests and scenarios, all in this land around there. And it was very, very similar to creating a paper role-playing adventure. And that's essentially what it was for us. And then we handed it over to the digital folks at SSI out in California, and they did all their things with it. But it was basically the same game that we created on paper. And that, to me, I got the digital bug from that, and I went into digital games. But it really wasn't that hard a transition. Those 40 video games and computer games that I've worked on, I never wrote a single line of code. I did lots of narrative design, lots of dialogue and character writing. I did a bunch of game design, laying the plans, writing game design docs and various quest docs and level docs and all that stuff. And I also ended up doing a lot of scripting, getting characters into the game and making them do things and events and all that stuff. But it was a pretty easy transition. There were these skills that you had to learn on top of the analog skills you had, but it was never a really steep learning curve. It was always, it was fairly easy for me. So I think anybody, whether you want to do digital games or analog games, I think working on analog games and getting your game design skills, getting your narrative skills in that way, analog is much faster moving. It's much faster to get an analog game up and running than it is a digital game that takes a couple of years really to get a digital role-playing game, single-player role-playing game up. But anybody who wants to go into the game industry, I'd suggest taking as many analog RPG classes, analog game design classes as you can, because that gives you all the basic skills that you need for game design, whether you're going to go into analog or digital.
I remember, since I had played Dungeons and Dragons when I was 9, kind of in the early 80s, and then say the late 80s, early 90s when I was, playing some video games, I remember playing some certain games and just being like, well, this is just Dungeons and Dragons on the computer, right? And it was like,
yeah,
they had nothing to do with Dungeons and Dragons, but I was like, this is exactly the same. There's like to hit, I have health points, I'm collecting certain items. It was just like, it's the same thing.
Yeah. A lot of the game mechanics are very similar across genres. And, it's just, there's so many things that came from that original D&D game. So many genres of games that sprang from that it's really an interesting thing to trace the history back and also realize that when you're playing a digital game, you're really playing an analog game with some digital frosting on top of it.
Kind of understanding that some of those people who were working on Dungeons and Dragons then moved into video games.
Right. Zeb Cook that I mentioned worked with me on Pool of Radiance. He's been working in digital games for probably 25 years. I think he moved into them a couple of years after I did. And he and I worked together again on the Elder Scrolls Online game. He was at ZeniMax Online, and I applied there, and he remembered me and got me hired there. So we worked on, the Elder Scrolls Online for a few years together. Jim Ward, who is another person who worked on Pool of Radiance with me and Zeb, he's someone you might have heard of. He created Metamorphosis Alpha, which was the very first science fiction role-playing game. Gamma World came from that, and the Fallout series came directly from those. You can see Gamma World and Metamorphosis Alpha when you look at Fallout. Jim Ward has been in analog games. He just stayed in analog games for 45 years, and he's been making, he's still making analog games, writing lots of role-playing game product. And Steve Winter, the fourth person who worked on Pool of Radiance, he did some digital work. He wrote a lot of the robot dialogue for Quake 3 Arena, the bot dialogue. But he's mostly stayed in the analog realm. So there's, people who were with me at TSR. Jeff Grubb, it works for Amazon Game Studios now, digital games. So yeah, there's a lot of people who crossed over, a lot of people who stayed in analog games, and a lot of people who went to digital and then have kind of come back to analog games.
You've started telling us a little bit about the program at Webster University, but just to kind of go into it a little bit more in detail, so you teach game and narrative design, is that correct?
Yes, and I teach several classes there. We built I built a narrative design branch, sort of a couple of narrative design classes, and there's an introductory class to digital game design. There's another one for analog game design where students build board games. I just introduced this semester the class that you came and talked to, analog role-playing game class, where the students are on 3-person teams and each team's creating a role-playing game. There's a companion to that next semester, a digital role-playing game class, digital RPG design, where students can take the work that they've done in this analog class and convert it to a digital format using something like RPG Maker or Unity or Unreal, and they can create an entirely new game and build that out in a digital format. And we also have next semester we're building in kind of a game lab class where we'll be putting students on teams of 8 to 12 people, and they'll be all working on a project that semester. And they'll create a digital prototype during the semester. And we have classes on level design. We have classes in animation and art. We have classes on sound design. Basically, all the disciplines that are in the game industry. There are classes on concept art. There's 2D and 3D art. Basically, everything that goes into the game industry, we're making sure that we get into our program. And I'm there, and I've got 35 years of experience in the game industry. We have a couple of adjuncts who have 5 or 6 years of experience at a company called Pixel Press, which has done a bunch of digital games in Unity. And we've got one of our other adjuncts that's a part-time instructor. He runs his own board game company. He's got a company called Genius Games that does science-based board games, and he teaches a couple of our board game classes. And we've got another adjunct who has been a producer and has worked at various companies. And so we've got basically anyone who wants to go into game design in college, find out who's going to teach you and make sure they've got experience in the game industry, because otherwise, as far as I'm concerned, they don't really know what they're talking about. They don't really know how to tell people how to build games unless they've done it themselves professionally. And so that's something, as we're looking at, I'm kind of the facilitator for the program now. And so I'm helping find adjuncts and people to teach for us. And the one thing they all have to have is experience in the game industry. That's, a minimal qualification, and then, degrees and experience teaching. But we just want people who know what they're talking about and have that experience to convey to students. And I think students are really kind of appreciative of that. One of the things students tell me in the evaluations at the end of the year is they want me to tell more stories, more game industry stories, because they like to hear that stuff. And so, we're looking for people who have that experience and convey that experience to students and have those stories to tell.
The professors are not having experience in the realm that they're teaching is kind of a flaw that I noticed when I was going to college. So I'm glad that you are making sure that the instructors have experience in the game industry. Well, part of me, of course, is just wondering where a major or classes in game design was when I was going to college. Just 20 years ago or so now. I just find it fascinating that you can have like 85 students who are that interested in game design. They get to explore some of these kind of different areas.
And it's great. I teach the senior overview class, which is where seniors are taking everything they've learned at Webster and they're creating a project that's going to be the capstone for their portfolio. And it's really, really interesting to see the different projects. Some students are kind of more into programming, and so they're doing a lot of game mechanics and implementation in games. Other students are doing animation projects where they're taking a single character and animating it through several actions. Other students are doing art projects like concept art and 2D and 3D art. There's just a variety of interests in the program, and they want to do game design, but they also want some animation. They can get that because we've got a big animation program here. Art they can get as well, and sound design. We've got a great audio department, our audio program, I should say. And so it's not just game design that they're doing, it's game design and other interests that they have, and they're merging those. Because game designers in the industry can come from any discipline. In the years I worked in digital games, I had creative directors who came from, they had been programmers, some of them had been artists, some of them had been web designers, some of them had been narrative designers. They can come from any discipline and lead a team. And game designers basically can come from any discipline, within the industry. And so these students are all doing really interesting projects that are all very different. And it's not just, coming up with game design. They're just doing a whole bunch of different things.
Or at least it does seem like there's a wide variety of backgrounds for people who are designing games, that they come from, different disciplines and in at TSR, Analog Role-Playing Games, Jeff Grubb was a civil engineer, and Zeb Cook, I forget what Zeb was. He had like an English degree. Doug Miles taught rhetoric in high school. We came from, and I had a physics background. We all sorts of different backgrounds, but we all loved games. And game design is just a skill that you learn, and you learn by doing it. And so, like you're saying, like we're both saying, you can come from any discipline and get into game design. So I guess just to follow up on that a little bit. So what would you say to somebody who's been out of college now for, a number of years or maybe even a decade or two and or more, and they're thinking like, I've always had a love of games. How could I cross into the gaming industry?
One thing I'd say to them, if it was someone, and this is true anywhere, but in St. Louis, there's a surprisingly big game development community of small professional companies here, both analog companies like John Covey's Genius Games, and also digital game companies like Pixel Press and Butterscotch Shenanigans. And they have meetups of game development meetups every week or two, and they have get into their Facebook groups, get in to their meetup groups, and just get in there and start talking to people who are doing this. And some of them are doing it professionally, full-time. Some of them are doing it part-time after their real job at, Anheuser-Busch or wherever they happen to work. And others are just kind of amateurs. They just kind of like the idea of making games, and they think they'd be interested in it, and they want to give it a try. There's all sorts of people in these game development communities that you can just connect with and, just get inspired by. find out what people are doing that kind of inspires ideas for you to do things, and, ask for advice. How would people go about doing such and such, getting pieces for a game? What are sources that you can get for, pawns and cards and all this stuff if you're doing analog games? There are people doing role-playing games. St. Louis, has this big community of people who are making games, and any town, of a decent size, any city would have a community like that. So I'd suggest looking at meetup groups, looking at Facebook, just finding those groups, getting in with those groups, and then let that inspire you, and, find people that you can work with too.
I guess too, nowadays with the advances in technology, since, now anybody can self-publish a book or a game. What's your take on self-publishing?
I think it's a hard road to hoe. I know you've made it work, and that I think the vast majority of people fail to do it. I think self-publishing for most people may work better if you've been in the game industry, you've learned from people who, have been doing it for 20 or 30 years, and then you go off on your own. I think that may work out best for people. When you're self-publishing, there's really no quality bar for you to hit. When you're at a game company, there are quality bars that they make you hit, or your game fails. There are quality that fans and reviewers make you hit. I think self-publishing is a really hard thing for people to do, and I'm really impressed that you've succeeded at it. But it is a way to get in. It's a way to get prototypes that you can actually show to companies and maybe get in with a company or get a company to publish for you. Yeah, self-publishing, I think, is a hard thing. You have to be really self-motivated. You have to have skills that, game design is hard. It's a skill that you have to learn, and it takes quite a while to learn how to do it well. And so if you're just a high school kid doing it on your own, or somebody came out of college, you don't have that experience of learning from people who've been doing it for years and years and years. You just haven't picked up all that knowledge, and you're kind of reinventing the wheel all the time by making all the same mistakes that everybody's made who doesn't have that much experience. The game industry is really a craft. There's very much an apprentice, journeyman, master kind of sequence, and a lot of companies kind of codify that, where you start out as a level 1 designer, and then after a few years you're level 2, and and you go up the ladder. And it's just like, you need to learn from people who've been doing it longer than you. And that's really hard to do if you're self-publishing on your own. You can do it by getting into those meetup groups, getting into other, social situations where you're interacting with a bunch of people who are working on games. And then, if you're self-publishing, then you've got friends in the game who are also doing games, who can play test your stuff, give you feedback. So I'd say self-publishing is a really hard thing to do. I applaud the people who've succeeded at it. I know there are lots of people who haven't. And from my advice to people would be to get some experience working at a company, learn from those people who've done it a long time, and then if you want to go off on your own and self-publish, you've got a skill set to work with.
I guess maybe I am kind of an outlier, but yes, I started all on my own trying to figure this out. But I appreciate your take on that, and it is definitely difficult. It is definitely difficult. How would somebody get a job at a gaming company if they've never had any professional experience, though? I guess that's where I always get kind of caught up.
That's the catch-22.
Yeah.
If you look, like, for digital games, there's gamasutra.com, which has a job board, and that's probably the best place to look for professionals and to look for jobs in the industry. But every single job has a requirement. They'll say 3 years of game industry experience or 5 published AAA games.
Yeah.
There's always this experience requirement. Very, very, very few jobs are for our entry level. And the reason for that isn't to be snobby or cut people out. It's when you're at a company and you're working with people, collaborating with this group of people. The teams I've worked on, the smallest one ever was 25 people. The biggest one was 450 people. And there's a lot, it's massive collaboration. And looking at a veteran of the game industry, you know that that person, that man or that woman has had a lot of collaborative experience. They've learned how to channel their creativity into this team direction and work with others and, get a good game out. But, and that's, I think, the reason why companies really want veterans, because they've passed that sniff test of, can they work with other people? When you're looking at someone right out of college, you don't know that. You can't tell what their collaborative skills are like, what their soft skills are like. So what I tell students is, whatever your discipline is, whether you're a coder or a writer or a game designer, artist, animator, whatever you are, always apply for any job in that field that you see that you're interested in, even if it says 5 years of experience in the game industry. I just say, you lose out on 100% of the jobs you don't apply for, so to apply for these jobs. But the way I tell people to get into the game industry, the biggest pipeline into the game industry, and most of these students want to get into digital games. I tell them to look for QA jobs, quality assurance jobs, playtesters, and that's the biggest pipeline into the game industry. For QA, they're not looking for you to have game industry experience. They want you to have experience playing games, and they want to know that you can talk about games and analyze games and think about why that game is fun or why it isn't fun or what could have been better. When they interview you, they're going to want to know, tell us about a recent game you've played and what you thought about it. And if you were on the QA team for that game, what would you have told the developers to help improve the game? And they want to know that you think about games and you enjoy games. And those are the requirements to be QA. And, someone who hasn't been in the game industry thinks of QA as, they're all like high school dropouts and stuff. But I'd say, I've worked with hundreds of QA people over the years, and I'd say about 70% of them have college degrees. And QA is their way into the industry. And it's essentially an apprenticeship. And you work in QA for a year or 2 years, and all of a sudden when an opening appears at that company for the discipline that you have a degree in, like art, programming or whatever, you're an internal candidate, and they know you and they have worked with you. They know what you're like to work with. And all of a sudden you're a top candidate for that job. Plus you've got game industry experience now. You've been QA on a AAA project or for 1 or 2 years. And that counts as game industry experience. QA is a real position in the game industry. It's a vital position. And that is what I tell people is the biggest pipeline into the game industry. And I know so many people who came up from QA. The guy who was VP of development at Volition and eventually ended up being president, he was QA on Pool of Radiance 20 years earlier. He was a QA guy on the very first digital game I worked on, and he just worked his way up. I know producers who started out in QA, executive producers. I know creative directors who started out in QA. It's a huge way into the game industry, and then there's this big upwelling from QA into the positions that you really want. So I talk to all my students about apply for all those jobs that are in your field, but look really hard for QA jobs, because that's the best way into the game industry as far as I'm concerned in my experience.
What was the game that had the team of over 400 people?
There were 2 MMOs, massive multiplayer online game. One was Elder Scrolls Online, and the other was a game that will never come out called Kingdoms of Amalur from 38 Studios. That was a company founded by Curt Schilling, who is a Major League Baseball player.
Yeah.
He won World Series with Boston and Arizona Diamondbacks.
Yeah.
And he sunk $50 or $60 million of his own money into this company. And they'd been going for about 5 years working on this MMO, and they'd gotten up to about 400 people, and I had joined them. And then 9 months after I joined, they just ran out of money and the company collapsed. But anyway, those 2 teams were 350 to 450 people. They're just huge, huge teams. I was on the Far Cry 3 team up at Ubisoft Montreal, and that was about 250 people, which was a big, big team for a single player game. But MMOs take a long time. They take 3, 5, 6 years to make, and they take literally hundreds of people. So those are, to my mind, the biggest projects in the game industry, the biggest teams.
Okay, well, you had mentioned earlier that you're working on a board game. Could you just tell us a little about that real quickly?
Sure. There's an artist by the name of Wayne Barlowe that probably don't recognize his name, but you'd recognize his stuff. He did really the first kind of fantasy sci-fi coffee table book. It was called, oh God, now I'm spacing the name of it. It was an alien. Anyway, Wayne Barlowe, he's worked on Harry Potter movies. He's worked on Lord of the Rings movies. He's basically an artist, a concept artist. Oh, it was Barlowe's Guide to Extraterrestrials was the book he created. Okay. Anyway, I had picked up a book of his probably 6 or 7 years ago called God's Demon, which is about, demons are fallen angels. They sided with Lucifer and got tossed down to hell. And the book was about a major demon who wanted to get back to heaven, who wanted to earn his way back into God's grace and get back into heaven. And it's a really, really well-written book. It's really engaging. And I've read it probably 6 or 7 times. And about the 3rd or 4th time I read it, I thought, boy, this would make a great board game. This would make a great kind of Risk-like board game. And I contacted the book company, who put me in touch with his agent, who put me in touch with him. And I said, hey, I'd love to make a board game based on God's Demon. And he was really excited about it. And so we worked out a deal. And I'm creating a board game that's kind of a combination of Risk. There's a little bit of Fortress America in it, a little bit of Shogun. There are different mechanics that I've always enjoyed in various analog games, various board games that I'm working into this game. And it's basically a map of hell based on Wayne's map from his book. And basically you're trying to take over hell, essentially, become the new head demon. And it's kind of Risk-like, where you're trying to beat up everybody else and eliminate them. And there are card sets, and so I'm working on several card sets and miniature figures. It's kind of taken me a long time. It's been slowed down. I just finished writing a textbook on narrative design and game design that's going to be published by Taylor and Francis, a big textbook publishing company. I just finished that 3 days ago, literally, and that's been kind of sucking up a lot of my time. But now I'm going back to the board game and making more card sets and trying to get that up and running to the point where we can play test it. Fortunately, I've got all these students who are interested in board games and all sorts of games, and they're kind of a built-in playtesting group that I think would love to try out a new game. And it's also a way for them to get credit, game industry credit, because they'll get credit as playtesters.
Well, that sounds great. All right. Well, my guest today has been Mike Breault. Mike, I thank you so much for coming on the podcast, and I will provide links to the program at Webster University, as well as some information about you in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. So again, I just want to thank you for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
Well, there you have it, guys. I really hope you enjoyed this conversation with Mike Breault today. If you go to dicegeeks.com and check out the show notes for this episode, you will find links to the game design department at Webster University, where Mike teaches. Also, if you want some free stuff, head over to dicegeeks.com/free. You will get 10 free dungeon maps, and you will never miss an episode of this show. Also, if you would please consider supporting the show on Patreon, that would mean the world to me. Head over to patreon.com/dicegeeks to see how you can help keep this show going. All right, guys, I thank you for listening, and until next time, keep gaming.